All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, entering the kingdom of the cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts. I am one of the co-hosts here. I am joined by a beardless Super Sleuth Andrew in Harriman, Utah. I was a little concerned. I thought maybe there's a Harriman multiverse where there's like a different, is there an imposing agent, imposing Super Sleuth Andrew? Just tell me real quick, what happened? How'd you lose the beard?
Well, I lost the beard because, as you know, birds aren't real, beards aren't real. So just this weird thing wasn't working out, and my beard just disappeared off my face because there's no such thing as beards anyways. So I'm doing great, and this is how I really look. This is like how, Neo looks super awesome when he's in the Matrix, but when he came out, he was all plugged in and got those tubes on him. This is just the real me.
I know. I feel like I'm meeting the younger Andrew from your driver's license. So this will be some getting used to. But anyways,
oh boy,
I am super excited. We have a very important subject to talk about today. It's one of our first series here of the new year in 2022. So in Cultish, we have talked a lot about the world of the cults. Specifically cult leaders, the theology behind the theological distortions in regards to cults. But a lot of times we have consistently talked about manipulation. This is something that even outside of the world of the cults, a lot of us are probably, we're aware of this. It's just something that resonates with so many people, and it's just a very important subject to talk about. So we're going to be kind of going into the nitty gritty of the practical application, because so many times we think of manipulation in regards to cults, and it's something that's out there. But in reality, it's something that's in so much closer proximity to us. But before we introduce our guests, also, we have Stan with us from Apologia Church. How are you, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. I got to the studio. I got to leave my job early. So I'm a teacher, and the kids were doing state testing today. So I just left them with the sub, and I was hoping everything would be just fine. And I was like, you know what?
Awesome. Excellent. And so I'm glad that you're on with us today, because this is, you have a lot of interest in this subject at hand. And as we unravel the podcast, people will see why you took time out of your day after a long day of work to come over here and be part of this conversation. So I'm looking forward to that. So our guest today is Michael Foster. Mike, how are you?
Doing great, guys. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So just real quick, can you just tell everyone just a little bit about yourself and why is this a passion topic? This issue of not only just manipulation, but tactics of manipulation or tactics of manipulators. It's kind of multifaceted, but just tell us a little bit about yourself and your passion for the subject that we're going to talk about.
Sure. I'm a pastor. I pastor a church in Batavia, Ohio, right outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. Our church is about a year old, but I've been in the ministry the bulk of my adult life. And I'm married with 7 kids, 4 boys, 3 girls. We live on a small farm. I got into researching masculinity a couple of years ago and wrote a book that got published by Canon Press called It's Good to Be a Man. And we did a podcast that's like kind of still alive. We do an episode every once in a while. But and in researching masculinity, I started to look at these kind of online gurus that these men were going after, surrounding, listening to all their podcasts, reading all their books, buying like $100 manuals on how to be a man or whatever, little PDFs. Actually, they're like 50 pages. They're paying like $100 for it, and got interested in why these guys were going to these kind of guru type guys. And then as I did that, I saw a lot of the tendencies in these online gurus actually in the leadership of many churches. Like I said, I've been in the ministry in one way or another since I've been about 18 years old. I was a junior high youth pastor, a church planter twice now, associate pastor, and now senior pastor. And just because of peers in the ministry, you hear these stories about these interactions they deal with, elders boards or a particular elder. And then as people coming out of your church, joining your church, transferring, you hear these stories as well. And a lot of times you can kind of view those through the lens of people always being victims.
Right.
And playing out like every little negative thing ever, they exaggerate it into some terrible spiritual abuse and spiritual trauma. And on the flip side, you can read through the lens also, or like alongside that, actually, the lens of people just hating authority, and anyone that tells them anything that offends them, they overreact to and call it abuse. But after a while, you start to see trends and say, you know what? while some of that, it's kind of like racism. Like a lot of the people saying things are racist, they're not actually racist, but there is real racism, right? And there's a lot of things that people call spiritual abuse, which is actually this faithful Christianity, rebuking them, telling them to repent of their sins, pursue holiness, to love God, to make no provision for the flesh, all that sort of stuff. But then there are things that fall into a category of abuse, in that it is an abuse of authority. Like authority, all authority is delegated by God to be used for his purpose in his way. And when you go outside the limits of your authority, then you're moving into into something that's not good, that's not godly, and I think could rightly be called an abuse. You know, I was thinking about how to frame this for a podcast that's on cults. And here's how I would do it. This is from the Westminster Confession. And even this is a part that us Credo Baptists and Paedo Baptists can agree on. It says the purest churches under heaven are subject both to mixture and error, and some have so degenerated as to become no churches of Christ, but synagogues of Satan. Nevertheless, there shall always be a church on earth to worship God according to his will. So what it's saying is that all churches have a mixture of error and truth in it. And some are so bad, they're not churches at all, right? So there's churches that are more pure and less pure, and this kind of improper way of exercising lawful authority that can be called abuse exists in an extreme form in cults, right?
Yeah.
But it's still in seed form present, like all sins are in any church. And so all of us have this in our church. It doesn't mean that the church necessarily is when you should leave. It doesn't mean that the pastor is evil and a cult leader, but there's a spectrum in which these things exist on, and they can get worse and worse and worse to the place where you're dealing with something that maybe it's not a JW or a Mormon or whatever, but it is become functionally now a cult. And so we need to look for these in ourselves, in our own heart. That's where you always start with yourself. Take responsibility for yourself.
Right.
These manipulative tactics and repent of them. And so what's my passion? My passion is helping men, but also being godly in my leadership as a pastor. Like, I'm not scared to exercise my authority, been given authority by God to preach the word, to minister the sacraments, and I'm not backing down. That being said, there is a right administration of that authority, a lawful administration, and that I want to do in a way that honors God, because I believe that's what he'll bless, and that's what grows the church and grows Christians.
No, that's really good. I appreciate you saying that, Michael. And one of the things, too, we want to emphasize is especially defining terms, because I totally agree with you. You know, we are in a postmodern society, especially, you mentioning the word racism that gets thrown around, and especially you're starting to realize that words are starting to lose meaning. You think of the Kyle Rittenhouse case, where people are just, screaming out the words racist, and these emotional impact terms totally devoid of any factual reality. And we always want to make sure we define our terms in the same way, too, that a lot of the conversations, even the cultural conversations surrounding, words like manipulating, gaslighting, these are 10 tactics that talk about that, but they're from a secular point of view. So given that we're in a postmodern society, that whole category from a secular point of view starts to become very vague and arbitrary. And really, there's a lot of, how do you reach through the fog and actually define what that is? Like, who exactly is right? I mean, you saw this, for example, in there's a series that came out in A&E, Scientology: The Aftermath, where Leah Remini, who was hosting the King of Queens, she was talking about a lot of the abuses and the manipulation, but she's someone who's not a Christian. And so you go, like, how do you give an accounting for that? So you were absolutely correct. I would also say that the existence, Walter Martin would say that the existence of a counterfeit predicates the authenticity of an original. So in the same way how there is a correct way as a pastor to exercise authority that's been given by God, that area is definitely abused a lot, and that abuse, the manipulation, especially when it comes to spiritual leadership, would stem from that abuse. But just real quickly, in regards to just defining terms, when we just say the word manipulation and manipulators, what would be an accurate biblical definition of that? How would we define that?
So manipulation is a pretty new word. only a couple centuries old, and it just meant to shape something with your hands. In modern vernacular, what we mean by it is it's to exert control or influence in a clever or unfair way. And so a manipulator would be someone that's a defining trait. It's not a one-off or whatever. The OR makes it something that they do all the time. And if you think about that, someone that exerts control and influence in a clever and unfair way, we'll just drop the or for a moment. That's a good description of what we see in false teachers. In the New Testament, you see kind of, I think there's three components that you can easily define or narrow down. There might be more, but they have a self-centered agenda. So they draw disciples after themselves. Think of Acts chapter 20 with the Ephesian elders. Paul says that savage wolves will rise up from amongst yourself, and they draw them after themselves. Jude 1:12 says, describing false teachers, that they care for themselves. Now, in the context there, it's not like a general care that you provide for yourself, but what it really means is they care only for themselves. Right. So a manipulator has an agenda that's tied up with their person. They're deceptive with their words. So manipulation, you can't deal with it on the up and up. You can't lay out the straightforward evidence and arguments why you should do something, right? So you have to massage the words. And one of the defining characteristics of a false teacher is that he uses smooth words. He uses flattery. He's a deceiver. And you see that again in, I think it's Jude 1:16, where it says that they flatter you trying to gain an advantage, right? And then lastly, they're coercive in their tactics. This one you got to pull out a little bit, but if you consider the super apostles in 2 Corinthians 10 and 11, they're basically saying, look, Paul ain't nothing. That's what they're saying. Guy's little, he stutters and all this stuff. And they're trying to poison the well and say, no, we're the only one you should listen to. We're the real deal. You see a similar thing going on in 3 John, where Diotrefés is not either receiving the word from John, the elder, and that probably means he's not receiving the messenger that John sent. Right. In other words, and the reason isn't is a moral reason. John doesn't say, well, because he doesn't believe in the resurrection. John says because he loves to have the preeminence, right? He wants to be the top dog. So he's trying to ultimately isolate this congregation under his control. I think it's likely that Diotrefés, to have that sort of authority, is probably an elder or teacher or something like an officer in that church. And so those are the three things you see: a self-centered agenda, deceptive with their words, and a coercive tactics where they make you feel like they're the only option, the only source of truth or whatever. And you see all those things in cults, but they can exist in a less than weakened form. You can probably I can think of when I've done all those things in my life, right? This is why I need Jesus. This is why I'm glad the Holy Spirit's in me, and sanctification is incremental, but we're making ground. And
No, I appreciate that. And real quick, before we kind of delve into further, I want to bring you and Andrew. So just tell me, just real quickly, just off the get go, and I'm sure you did your own little super sleuth in regards to what we're going to talk about, and especially we're in the middle right now. You're in the middle right now of, Andrew, just a brand new church plant. You are the head deacon at Apologia Church, Utah. So this is probably an area that you will be dealing with if you haven't done with it already. But just tell me, just off the get go, Andrew, what makes you excited to be a part of this conversation, just about the topic of manipulation in general? What comes to mind? Why do you think this is an important subject to talk about, Andrew?
I think this is an extremely important topic to talk about, because this is something that's happening right now in the church, right? Like red flags, like Jerry, you love those red flag posts where you say, there's the guy fixing the toilet at Joel Osteen's church. Red flags when $600,000 pops out the wall, right? That's definitely a sign of something that's happening there. And I'd say the church is most destroyed, not from without, but from within, right? Especially when people are doing manipulating tactics. And like Brother Michael said here, or Pastor Michael said here, like we all suffer with those things. But like you also said, Jerry, the counterfeit presupposes an authentic. So my question too, I want to ask for Michael real quick is what in the Bible do we have shown to us as safeguards given as pastoral eldership is a delegated authority given by God? He also gives like qualifications and requirements. Like, so what are some of those safeguards that we have in place in Scripture to actually know that something is being done correctly in terms of pastoral leadership?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a huge topic. I mean, you can look at the qualifications for elders first off in their character. 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1, 1 Peter 5. 1 Peter 5 is a big one, right? That you don't lord it over them. And so you can look at the sort of, the characteristics of their life, their household, that these men are, that's what I saw in the online stuff with masculinity, is that these guys were able to posture a sort of way of being that was not congruent with their actual reality. And that's, they need to go through testing. So one question is, with any leader in a church, where did they get this authority from? Did they just bring it to themselves? You know, who do they answer to? Have they answered to anyone before in their entire life? You know, I was thinking about what did Driscoll do wrong, right?
Yeah.
So at the time of this recording, they just finished the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. And man, the last episode was pretty weak. There was obviously a liberal agenda through all of them.
Yeah.
But I think the issue of manipulation and the issue of leadership structural issues and all that's there. And part of what I saw that I think went wrong with Driscoll, it really was like kind of two main things. One is that he never was accountable to anybody else, really, when we get right down to it. Mm-hmm. And the second thing was he started to see himself as the national platform, not accountable to his local community. And you can kind of trace everything to those two things. And they actually identify that, I think, correctly. Yeah. In that podcast. You know, there's a lot of things wrong about that podcast, but there is, you know, an epidemic of narcissistic sort of leaders going on. And so what does the Bible say? Well, number one, we just ordained 3 elders this week at our church, and I was installed. So I was sent out as a church planner from a mother church. Mm. And then I was given certain authority to gather a congregation, to serve the sacraments, and to start to raise up leaders. But I didn't confer. I didn't raise up all the leaders on my own. They had to answer to someone else in my denomination, the CREC. And so when these people are appointed, they're appointed by other elders. And so that's, you know, even if you're an independent church, you don't agree with Presbyterianism, you still want to know that these men, often Baptists will put together associations or whatever. And I think that's a good practice, that there's outside people that look at these people. You know, it's always good to have you date before you put a ring on it. And you need to go through that process with churches. And so have they been tested and made sure they have those qualifications? That's where I would start. Mm. And so with Driscoll, what do you have? You have a guy who just started a church because he wanted to, and then he went out to get money. Mm. And that's what he said. I mean, those are his words, and that's part of the narrative. And should it surprise us that someone as talented with such a drive and engine as a guy like that wasn't accountable to anyone blew up? You know, yeah. I left X29 in 2007 because I told my wife, I said, man, Driscoll's angry and he's a powder keg and he's going to explode and I don't want to be part of it. Mm. Now, I didn't know it was going to go down the way it did. Like, that was pretty surprising, to be honest. But I think we can look at him, and instead of like, he's a cautionary tale for anyone, especially guys like, you know, like you guys have this podcast, and that brings a lot of influence and kind of fanfare. If you guys are anything like me, you get emails where people are pouring their heart out and asking for help. Right. Yep. And if you're not anchored to your local community and have the right things, there's a lot of potential to let it go to your head and take advantage of people. And in a social media age, in a disembodied internet age, we have to be very careful about letting this stuff go to our head. So have you been trained by people that know you? And have you actually gone through all these steps? That's a good starting spot.
No, that's really good. And I definitely appreciate you saying that. We did a podcast a couple of probably like a month or two back, kind of reviewing the podcast, a lot of aspects of the. I do agree they did call some balls, and we called balls and strikes on the podcast where they got right and where they fell short. And I think even the areas where they did where they called it for what it was. They did point out the spirit, the aspects of the spiritual abuse and kind of that narcissistic headship, the abuse of authority. They didn't give an ultimate point of reference, and it's not surprising given
or a solution, right?
Right.
You listen to that whole podcast that, I was thinking about, like, there is no compelling answer.
Right.
And it's like, this is all bad. All these people got hurt. We shouldn't do this. All right. What should we do?
Exactly.
Like, repentance is to turn from one thing to another. Like, so in other words, what you walk away with, the real narrative is authority is bad, and especially patriarchal male authority.
Right. Exactly.
That's the undernote. You have when you spray cologne on, there's the first smell you have, and then your body chemistry kills that. And you're left with another smell like 30, 40 minutes later. Well, the smell you're left with after listening to that podcast is men bad, leaders bad, authority bad, right? And so I don't blame people that are conservatives for not liking it. I get it. But those of us that have been in leadership or have some sort of social platform, aspects of it resonated with it because the Holy Spirit's in us, and we do not want to abuse what the Lord has given us.
No, absolutely. And just real quickly, Stan, share with everyone, like, what is it about this subject? Like, what intrigues you about the subject of manipulation? Just real quickly before we move forward.
Yeah. So I actually had a situation or experience where I was dealing with manipulation from church leadership. So after I completed high school and I moved down to college, I was living in Missouri at the time. I joined a Southern Baptist Convention church that was Calvinist, and they had an amazing teaching pastor from the pulpit. I mean, every single Sunday he was preaching straight fire, and everybody really looked up to him and thought he was amazing, and nobody ever thought that he could do any wrong. I mean, this guy seemed to be super solid. But then it was around November, December 2018, he randomly disappeared and started giving excuses on why he wasn't showing up to the church, saying that a family member was ill and he had some other things to take care of. And then that kept on happening for a few months. And then he ended up showing back up to the church a few months later, and he ended up coming before the church at the end of service, sharing that he committed adultery and that he was stepping down from his position, that he was no longer qualified to be a pastor. And at the time, he held the position that once you are disqualified biblically from being a pastor, that you can no longer then, like, you can't become qualified again. That is it. You can't go into that position anymore. So after he came before the church and admitted his sin, he started going through counseling with the other elders of the church. And around that time, he started sending out some very weird emails to some of the members of the church, not to the entire church, but to some members, trying to explain his side of things. And with the other elders of the church trying to say that they were not listening to him, that they were trying to take advantage of him and put him on full blast, instead of trying to deal with his sin correctly. And just a whole bunch of craziness came out of this, not only just including the emails, but he ended up being excommunicated from the church because of his ongoing sin. He also ended up creating a Facebook page against the church and the elders there, as well as a slander website for the church, and was sending it out. And it was just absolutely awful. I remember for a time period, my name as well as some other people's names were on the website as well. But we were able to have some of those names taken down because of some work from some lawyers. But so I've been very deep into it.
Yeah. And your situation is just indicative of that. And in fact, anytime, Michael, we've ever posted anything, especially in regards to any level of spiritual abuse, I mean, we end up with a post with hundreds of comments. So, I mean, what we're talking about is just indicative of, on the receiving end of both men and women who have received the spiritual abuse. And even when it comes to authority, I mean, it's not just men who are doing this. There's also women in positions of authority who are perfectly capable and perpetrate these tactics of manipulation. So regardless of who you are, whether you're a man or a woman, these are tactics that you need to be wary of. And also, before you jump forward, is that I would just say too that Walter Martin did have a statement in one of his earlier lectures where he talked about how the cults are the unpaid bills of the church. That every single counterfeit of Christianity, especially in the 1800s, they all on some level came out of the church, and the church was not there to confront it and to squell it and to deal with that. And so a lot of the groups like Mormonism and Christian Science and a lot of those things are where they are today because the church didn't handle it properly. And I think especially, we're all passionate about, we're Christians. We need to confront the kingdom of the cults with the gospel. But I think in honesty, there is a level almost applying, a real practical application of Matthew 7, where it talks about, taking the plank out of our own eye. So if we have to look at ourselves and look in house and say, how can we as a church make sure we're not practicing these tactics? And especially because most cultists, when they come to Christ and they come out of the cults, a lot of them are hesitant to get plugged into a healthy church because they've experienced so much abuse. So we need to make sure that we take accountability and take ownership for the ways in which we have and ways we're capable of failing and even practicing these tactics of manipulators, so we can be a safe haven. Do you have any thoughts on that real quickly, Michael, before we jump?
I do actually. Yeah. I have quite a few. One is, I'm willing to predict with relative certainty that we're about to experience another explosion in cults, not unlike you had coming out of the Burnover district, right? Back in the day.
Yeah.
I think the social setting is ripe for it. I think the breakdown in the family makes people vulnerable to the offer of a family replacement. And the church is not a replacement for your family. Okay. The natural family is God's design. The church is a spiritual family. They're similar. They overlap in lots of ways, but I'm not my people's dad. I have fatherly duties as a pastor. A father exercises authority, cares for people in his family. And there's a sense in which a pastor does that, but it's still not a one-for-one thing. Right.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see a ton of that moving forward. Another way I'll demonstrate just how bad this is that the pandemic revealed how messed up we are in the way we lead people. What I noticed what happened in the pandemic, so my church has grown rapidly through the pandemic. We went from 0 to 200 plus members. I got 40 baptisms to do in January and February. It's getting nuts. And I heard everyone's stories as they came through here, and I was watching these large churches around my town kind of implode, these EV free churches that 10, 15 years ago were fantastic churches, right? I mean, they're as churches go, they're really good. They taught the Bible. They're kind of like soft complementarian, but still good churches you could send your friend to if you couldn't find like some really reformed church or whatever. Anyhow, so then the pandemic happens, and these guys don't know how to react to the mask mandate, to the vaccine mandates, to the social distancing, to being commanded to shut down and all that. And regardless of where you fall on it, what was interesting is that these guys who have never, ever played the authority card in their entire life as pastors are like, you must submit to my authority, right? They're like, suddenly, like these guys who had never, ever been like that, a sort of tyrannical side came out of them.
Yeah.
Right. And that's because they weren't ready. They're like kind of middle management guys, right? Like they're not entrepreneurs. They're not innovative. They're not like fiery prophet, like bold leaders that start things. They're people that maintain a structure, maintain rules. And churches need that. Churches have a lot of times are started by kind of like strong, gifted sort of individuals that are good at creating things, but sometimes maybe not the best at managing the day-to-day functions. You see that in churches. Well, these guys right away started like guilting everybody. Look, if you love your neighbor, you'll do what I tell you. And you see some of these manipulative tendencies it's in the water, man. It's in the air. This isn't about us all being victims. It's about us saying like, hey, the way we deal with relationships and the way we lead and manage people, there is something wrong because we've gone away from God's design for the family, God's design for the church. And everything is, sometimes it's cool. Everything's cool until, that there's some sort of dilemma. And then it really, really shows itself. And manipulators, the really bad ones love a good crisis, but you'll see it come out in people that are normally level-headed folks suddenly get nutty and start gaslighting you and projecting their motives onto you and all that sort of language, that sexual language. You're like, no, this is a pretty decent description of what's happening right now. And so I think it's something we should be concerned about. and get ahead of it and prepare our people, because people are going to move for jobs. They're going to leave our churches, and we want them to find a good church. And man, I wish it could just be by denomination or the creed they post on their church.
Yeah.
But frankly, that just doesn't cut it. Like, you're going to have to go and see the spiritual life of that church and exercise a level of discernment on whether or not you're going to join that church and be a member and submit to that leadership. Because you should join a church and submit to that leadership. But right now, like, whether it's SBC or PCA or CREC or whatever, all bets are off. Like, there's no safe haven, and I wish there was. And we have to start equipping people to exercise some discernment so they can put their family in a place and grow in grace.
Okay, good. Wow. Those are some really good points. Andrew, do you have a thought on that real quickly?
Yeah, I want to ask, how do you think our nation got there? Is it a lack of like biblical manhood? Is it a lack of fathers in the home? Like, what led to our nation having this type of epidemic at church? You know what I mean? Like,
sure,
not doing things pastorally, biblically.
So think of authority as energy. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Okay. So God has a set amount of authority. This is like an example. God delegates authority, and he delegates it, kind of simply stated, to three institutions: church, family, and the magistrate, right? That goes back to Calvin, Luther. A lot of people use that idea, and maybe it's not precise, but it's enough to help us think about things. So you have heads of the state, heads of the family, heads of the church. When one of those fails to exercise authority rightly, then someone's got to step in. So dad does not take care of his kids grow up to be criminals and they do bad things. Well, then the church has to discipline them, excommunicate them, or at least try to lead them in discipline. And then the state's got to come in and punish their crimes, right? And that's because dad failed to do that. Now, when that one institution fails to exercise their delegated authority, what happens is another institution gobbles it up, right? They absorb, because the authority's got to go somewhere. Someone's got to step in and take care of this. And so what we've had happen slowly but surely, for a variety of reasons, whether it's the Second Great Awakening, a bunch of different things like that kind of eviscerated the family and changed the nature of the church. The government became a nanny state, right? And gobbled up all that authority. And now it's like, we have to start reestablishing right authority in the family. But what happens, the guys that get that authority, like I'll say this on here, I'm patriarchal. I'm not complementarian. I think complementarian, first off, is hard to spell and it sounds stupid, right? Okay. Yeah. Secondly, it's a new word that they're created to try not to sound like big meanies, right? I understand that patriarchy is associated with bad things. I think there's an evil patriarchy. I think Satan is a father, right? And he has sons. And so there is a patriarchy that I mean to smash. There's another patriarchy that flows from God the Father, from which all fatherhood gets his name, that I want to be part of my whole life. Now, I have seen those that name patriarchy as their position who are terrible fathers, who really don't educate their daughters. They grow up and they dress them up like they're extras off Little House on the Prairie. Yeah. And these guys are kind of like fake macho men, right? And they posture the status that authority should be coupled with, but they don't have the actual mastery in their life. And so where we're at right now is we have people that are trying to, here's a better example for it. I know a lot of girls who shave their head, real short hair, and wear real tight clothes, and they get convicted and they associated that stuff with feminism. Yeah. Right. So they grow their hair out and they start wearing dresses, but they still have a brash attitude, right? They still have the attitude of a feminist. And I'd rather them have short hair and pants and have a gentle and quiet spirit than have long hair and dresses and have this brash, ungodly attitude. Well, these guys, they put the trappings of masculinity on, beard, shooting guns, whatnot, and they don't actually exercise the authority. And so now we're like in this weird corrective, like the authority balance is all off in between the institutions, and we're in the rubble. And it's going to take a little while to, this is a big ball of Christmas lights all wound up and pulling this thing out. It's going to take a lot of us working together. And if you want to if you go to the spiritual abuse sounding boards, there's a bunch of whiny victims and not all of them are telling the truth, but I read some and I actually figured out I knew those girls. And I'm like, you know what? That girl's not lying. She was really abused like that. That really did happen in a patriarchal home. And I think, well, what was called a patriarchal home. And I think she's just in being suspicious. I don't blame her. I would be too if I was in her position.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to happen because I love the God-given gift of patriarchy, the God-given gift of authority in the church. That's why we have to hate the counterfeit. We have to hate it. It's on to us to say, that's not real. That's not what I'm doing. And so what we're talking about here, I think is very important as we are in the age of rebuilding, of reclaiming, of kind of getting the balances out. And we can't just focus on authority, but we have to focus on responsibility and the limits of responsibility and the limits of authority, right? I can tell people what type of people they can marry. You can't marry a non-Christian. I cannot tell my people who they can marry, right? That's shepherding doctrine or whatever, that over shepherding. And we have to start making distinctions like that.
No, that's really good. In fact, Andrew, we were on the road. We talked to someone, a couple who had come, I believe the spouse had come from like a background of, being like an over the top, abusive patriarchal system where the father had way too much control, and kind of giving the examples that you were given. It was one of those things where I was telling her too, the same thing, that you experienced something that was counterfeit, and you can't throw out the original as far as that's concerned. So I really appreciate you saying that. Another thing I want to just ask you real quick before we kind of get into the nitty gritty as far as the tactics are concerned. So we're talking about the issues of church government having a proper view, a patriarchal view of authority, because a lot of these aspects in the church come from an abuse or distortion initially of what authority actually is, or misusing it. But it's when you think about just manipulation and those tactics, but really just the culture at large outside of the church. When you just look at just the world in general. In fact, you just released a new book called "It's Good to Be a Man." I actually got it on Kindle, and so I just binged through it in time for the podcast. Really enjoyed it. Fantastic book. But in it, you
appreciate your 5-star review on Amazon.
Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Definitely. But it was really good. And I think you did give some good examples of just cultural implications of where the culture is at large. But just in regards to the subject of manipulation, where we are at in 2021, and especially just kind of given the postmodern culture, there's the breakdown of gender, there's a breakdown of any aspect of really, we're in a post-Christian society as far as America is concerned. But what is about this, the culture large, that makes really a precipice for manipulation, just kind of given people's, just the zeitgeist of the age? Like, what is it about the culture that would make manipulation such a potential tactic to be in all of us?
It's a good question. I think when you don't have respect for truth, you're going to, where everything becomes about method and technique and not objective truth, right? And that seems to be where we're at right now. If I can get the right data and the right technique, I can fix anything, as opposed to having the right God, the right truth, and then you speak the truth and kind of let the chips fall where they may. People and so there's a lack of love for truth. And so then it's always about presentation of ideas, not the intrinsic rightness of those ideas, but about how they're presented, how they're massaged or whatever. You see that quite a bit. The other thing is when you don't grow up in a healthy family, you don't learn boundaries. And I'm kind of annoyed by the word boundaries because it's been used by so much psychobabble.
Oh yeah.
But boundaries is another way of saying limits, right? And limits of authority is an old way of talking about this topic. Whether if you're going to go look at like Charles Hodge's exposition on the Fifth Commandment of systematic theology, or in the larger catechism's exposition on the Fifth Commandment, which is obey your father and mother, or honor your father and mother. But they talk about limits and inferior, superior sort of relationships and all that. And so when you don't know how to manage relationships in a healthy way, that leads to the sort of manipulation. Like even the way that parents like discipline kids is very manipulative.
Mm.
And this is regardless if you spank them or don't spank them, right? It seems to be that it's like they're holding back their love or their affirmation or whatever. It's not restorative, like trying to correct a heart and behavior, but it's more about an adversarial relationship between a parent and their kid, right? Not you as their parent wanting to lead them to love the Lord, but them to respect your authority, that sort of stuff. And it becomes very adversarial. So people grow up with that, and they grow up in homes that everything's managed by manipulation, right? Well, son, if you really loved me, you would do this, right? As opposed to, son, God has put me over you and I love you. And this is what you need to do. This is the right way to honor God. This is what the Bible says. This is the right way to treat your neighbor. And you need to do that, And so I think we grew up in a world where there wasn't rightly ordered relationships. And out of that comes disorder, and manipulation's disorder. You go look at worldly wisdom in James chapter 3, selfish ambition, all that sensuality, it leads to disorder is what James says right there. And so, and I think the converse would be true. Disorder leads to that. So I think why manipulation's around because we don't know what right limits and relationships look like because we haven't seen it. Like many of us come from very broken homes.
Yeah.
And let's say we come from a decent nuclear family because, mom and dad met Jesus and they got serious when we were little or before we were born. But often there still isn't a Christian grandmother and grandfather. And when the Bible talks about family, like one way you can understand the biblical household is looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5, where it's talking about our responsibility to take care of our family. Well, who are they talking about? They're not talking about your kids and wives. They're talking about like widows. So we're talking about like these are sons taking care of their mom. And so the family in scripture is an extended family. Very few of us have an extended Christian family. So we're kind of like trying to figure this stuff out. So I think manipulation is just happens when there's not right understanding of identity and roles and responsibilities. And I think you learn that stuff in the household. And that's why if someone wants to be an elder in the church, he must manage his own household well. Because if he can't take care of that, how's he going to take care of the church? And that's something we don't even focus on. We think that just means his kids like sit quietly during worship service, right? That's not what that meant in the first century. Not what it meant at all. It was much richer than that. And so that's why I think we see so much manipulation, so much using kind of crazy emotional leverage to get people to do things. I mean, how many pastors deal with conflict? This is one of my, this isn't in my tactics post, but I know so many pastors that get mad at some guy. If I'm mad at you, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call you up and say, hey, I'm mad about this thing. What's going on? Right. That's how it's going to happen. But I know a lot of guys are like I know some people, it's like their Sunday sermon. I know some people that do things like yada, 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 and they're talking about you. They haven't talked to you. And now you are an illustration in their sermon. And this is how they're dealing with the conflict that they have with you.
Like very passive aggressive.
Very passive aggressive because they don't know how to deal with conflict. And you learn how to deal with conflict by watching your dad and other men argue it out and not beat the crap out of each other. Right. Learn to like disagree. And people, I think a lot of people out here that are like the heresy hunters, I think they hate conflict. I think they want to stomp fire out. Everyone thinks they're looking for it. I think they don't know how to deal with tension in life. When you have to have this sort of dad or father figure or other men in your life that show you how to deal with disagreements. Like, the surprise meeting sort of thing, like where you lead people into a meeting and then you like jump on them and let them know all the things you're mad about. The way I deal with that is I call someone up and say, I'm concerned about your marriage. Here's why. Can we get together and talk? I don't want them thinking for 5 days, I wonder what Michael's thinking about. And like building up this, like getting all anxious coming into a meeting. I want them to know exactly. Because then if they don't show up, then like, well, then it's probably worse than I thought it was. But at least, so these guys haven't been taught how to deal with conflict. And so they manipulate because it's all they know, I think. So that's why, I don't want to give too much on where you're going to go in the show. That's why I don't think all manipulators even know they're doing it. Right. It's not like, it's not super strategic. It's more like if I hit your knee with a little hammer, your foot kicks.
Every action, there's a reaction, basically.
Reaction. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Because I mean, sometimes too, like a lot of people we'll go into this as we uncover the tactics specifically, but a lot of them a lot of the tactics come from a reaction to confrontation. So,
Absolutely.
and some of that may be just like very tactical when you talk tactics of manipulator, but some of it just may be almost unconsciously like a knee-jerk reaction, for sure. So I could definitely see that being in play. Before we kind of jump into the tactics, real quick, Stan, is anything come to mind about what he's talked about that just comes to mind, kind of given your experience and what Michael's been talking about so far?
Yeah, well, Michael, you brought up James 3 there. I believe you brought up verse 16 there. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. My mind, actually, with James 3 went right above it to where that passage starts, where it says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic." So my mind, like a lot of times whenever it comes to these leaders who are inside of the church, who are being manipulative, a lot of times I'm like trying to think here, how much of this here is just like pure following them, or how much is unspiritual, like demonic stuff that's actually coming in too. If you wanted to speak on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, so all of it's sensual, right? Sensual means of the earth. It's talking about a lack of control of the body or the temperament and all of that. That's exactly what's going on in these cases of passive aggression, these cases of manipulation, where you're using improper leverage. It's and demonic in that it's very similar to the methods of demons, of the devil, who's a liar and manipulator, right? Manipulated Eve. Like, did God really say that? I mean, that's a form of manipulation. Like, it's a way of like creating doubt in their mind about the truth, right? It's kind of gaslighting to some degree. And so it's demonic in that way. If there's actual possession going on, I don't know if that's what it's saying in every case. I think it's saying that it's like that. I don't have a problem with it necessarily being literally demonic in like some sort of direct demonic activity, but it's certainly like the father of lies, right? It's certainly like a roaring lion that's looking for someone to devour. Manipulators are like false teachers, where they use people for their agendas. So false teachers, when we say false teachers, we're more or less talking about heretics, someone that's damned, not a believer. I don't want to say that everyone that manipulates, or even a manipulator necessarily, is equal to a true heretic, you know, but they are like acting in that direction and like that. And it's why, we live in a time where we are okay with quarrelsome spirits because we've reacted to the soft, liberal, sissy tone police. And now we let people just argue about every little dumb thing on Facebook, and we think it's manly. But the servant of the Lord isn't quarrelsome. He corrects gently and slowly. He's a patient man, right? And what we see in a lot of these people is a sort of quarrelsome, manipulative spirit. And that's not of God, man. That's not of God. And so, yeah, I see all those things at play there. I think that's a great passage to study, to say, as we look at ministries, we listen to how they reason, listen very carefully. I thought, again, in the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, now they had so much content to go through to put together whatever narrative they wanted, right? Like Driscoll has so many hours but they were pretty good at getting to some of the underlying psychology of the things he was saying. I do think we should listen to what a pastor appeals to. And one point they made is that Mark often appealed to himself as the hero, right? As the guy that did everything right. Well, look, I think that's kind of true. And certainly I've seen that in a lot of preaching. And my one of my elders, he's been a good friend for many years, but he'll tell me you've talked about yourself too much.
Yeah.
And praise God for someone that will say, because you don't want to make yourself the hero every time. Like if you, every once in a while you mention something from your life where you had a win because of the grace of God, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to be weird about it, but where every sermon, you end up being the hero and you do everything right and everyone's measured to your standards.
Yeah.
Well, that's not good either, man. That's like bending people to your agenda and making their faith about a personality. And even if you're a good man and get hit by a car, right, and die the next day, then what? Can a pastor ever replace them? And I remember once I did pulpit supply at this church, and I was young, and there was very old blue hairs there. And I came out, and there was literally, I kid you not, a bronze statue of the founder of the church. And I told the daughter of this guy, the pastor, who's now like 68 or something, trying to find a replacement. I said, if you want a replacement for this church, get rid of that bronze statue. Because I tell you right now, I would never take a call here. Not with that bronze statue, man. And so what we have is manipulators build a bronze statue of themselves through their sermon illustrations. And then you become the all. Everything's about you on this earth and not the heavenly wisdom pointing people towards God. And that's where a persuader persuades people towards the agenda of God, right? This is catechism number 1. The chief purpose of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That's persuasion. You're moving them towards God's agenda and not your particular application of it.
Okay. That's really good. And I think what we kind of did in this first episode is that many a times, people will, when are you guys actually going to talk about the tactics? Well, I would say that many a times, like you think of those memes that show like the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg that's like floating above, and then it shows like the foundation of like how deep the iceberg is. So I think what we did in this first episode, we kind of laid a real holistic, really biblical foundation of how we practically think about this, hopefully getting an understanding of what the culture is in the church and the church at large. And then what we're going to do in the second episode, we're actually going to go into the tactics. So we're going to leave a little bit of a cliffhanger, but next week, if you hang around, we're going to go deep into the tactics of manipulators, understanding how people manipulate and actually how to deal with it and how to address it. So thank you guys for listening, and we will talk to you guys next time on Cultish, where we enter into the kingdom of the cults. Talk to you guys soon.